Hello, everyone. Welcome to Deconstructors Club podcast. We have a very interesting episode today, and I would say it's supposed to be our first episode because we introduce ourselves. That is, we talk about our deconstruction journey. And I'm your host, Alex Weiss. I forgot to just do a quick introduction. And also Bob Azarito, our co-host, is here. And Bob, what's going on with this situation?
Yeah, so we did a great, really fun podcast for our first podcast. And the only problem is we lost the video. So we've got the audio, which is great because podcasts a lot of times.
My mom, as an evangelical, would say it's the devil.
Well, maybe
you got to blame it on.
It's possible.
Blame it on the techie demons or something. I don't know.
But yeah, so we still have the audio and we just wanted to be able to share that anyway. And so we're letting everybody know that this is it's our third episode. But it's going to sound like it's our first. So we kind of welcome you as if it's our first one. But
I literally say that, actually.
Say that. And you say it at the end also.
I say it at the beginning.
So glad you came to our first episode. Yeah.
Yeah. And because it's true. It really was our first episode. But we just couldn't really recapture that video. Don't know where it's at.
But we have the audio, and audio works great. Right. So we just wanted to let you know about that so that you weren't surprised,
right,
when you didn't see us.
And so and this episode, even though right now you're seeing us, but right for the remainder of this episode, it's going to be mostly audio, or it's going to be all audio, really, because that's all we have. Right. So if you're viewing this and then you just see our logo up, once again, our video is lost, but we do have the audio for you, and we just didn't want to do another take of it all.
Yeah, we liked it, and so we're going to give it to you in that form. But I did want to say a couple things because we have had a chance for the first two episodes to drop last week, and we're so excited that people seem to like it and are going to maybe stay with us and engage with us. And, that's really what we want, right? We want people to interact with their stories. Because one of the things I wanted to sort of say is that everyone's deconstruction is a little different. It has a little different flavor. It depends upon your context, your background, your upbringing. And then, sort of what sort of religious community you're a part of. So it'll feel a little different. So, don't get thrown off by our experience. Right. Don't think that because you didn't have our experience, somehow there's something amiss, because it's not. It's just that everybody has a reaction to different things within these conservative evangelical communities. And so we want you to feel comfortable with your own story. That's the whole point of this, is that we sometimes can feel like we need to fake it or pretend to not feel certain things, and it becomes so encouraging to be able to just be honest with what's really happening.
What we would love is for people to, if they would like to share some of their stories, send us, a DM. We are on Instagram at Deconstructors Club. Look us up. If you haven't looked us up yet on Instagram, we're there. We're on Facebook, Deconstructors Club Podcast. That's exactly how. Deconstructors Club Podcast. Look us up with that name. Also, not only Instagram, Facebook, we're on TikTok. You can check us out there. And of course, YouTube, where you can see the entirety of these episodes. But let us know. We'd love to hear feedback. I've gotten some feedback from some of you. Some have DM'd and have told us that, they're very excited about this. They are encouraged of the content that we have here. And I told them, hey, just hang on. You think these episodes are good. We have some really amazing guests. So,
and we're hoping to develop a community. Not just listeners who maybe, it's fine if you tune in, it's not your thing. Obviously, but we're hoping to develop a community so that we can interact together and be a part of each other's, ongoing development and reconstruction, and share some of those struggles that we have had in the past, and maybe some people are still having them, because, some of you might still some of the listeners might still be in evangelical settings or in evangelical churches, but they feel alone. So this is a place where they can have anonymity,
right?
And
we don't want them to feel alone in this journey. That's what we've been saying, and so, anyways, we don't want to keep on going on and on. We have a really cool episode coming up. And when you do check us out on YouTube, by the way, subscribe. Please don't just view the videos, subscribe. That really helps so that the word can go out. Because people need, I believe, one of the things that helped me in my deconstructing process were platforms like these that really encouraged me, made me feel identified. I'm not alone in this process. I'm not crazy. And what I'm thinking of right now, what is happening to me. So let us know, but subscribe and follow us in our Instagram.
And make comments too. Ask questions. Interact, because like I said, we want this to be a community, and so we need to any ways that you can reach out to us and respond. That would really be helpful to us. Yeah.
All right. Well, we're gonna air this episode, supposedly our first, so that you can get to know our journeys, Bob's journey, my journey. It's so funny. We come from totally different backgrounds, totally different contexts, but that deconstruction experience
share so much,
very similar.
Yeah,
so, and that's why we're doing this for all those that are watching and all those especially that are listening.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Tune in. Welcome everybody to our new podcast. Finally, this was a dream. This was a vision. This was something that we had in mind for a while that we wanted to do. And because we believe the message that we have needs to be out there. I mean, that's right now, who is we? We'll talk about that in a moment. But we are excited to be able to launch this brand new podcast. Our very first episode is this one. And we're just going to introduce ourselves, who we are, so you all can get to know who we are and why we're going to be doing these subjects and these topics. And so before we get into all of that, I want to introduce our co-host, featured guest. I don't know. We'll go down the list of what you are to this podcast. But I'll tell you one thing: you are a good friend of mine, and even though we don't have a long time of knowing each other, it just feels like we've known each other for a long time. Bob Azarito, tell us who you are.
Well, thank you, Alex. Who am I? So first thing I want to say is I think the reason this podcast came to be was because we felt like we started talking about some of these issues together, you and I. And the thought is, I think there are a lot of people who are talking about these deconstructing and reconstructing issues when it comes to the church. And I think we wanted to connect with those people, whoever they might be.
It's great.
Believing that, we didn't want this conversation to be just between the two of us. We wanted this conversation to be a larger community. And I think we both think that these topics are being discussed out there, but a lot of times they're being discussed just with privately with a few different people. And at least, for our area, we wanted to connect with those who are also asking those same kinds of questions.
It's interesting that you're saying that because I believe there's a reason why we don't know how many people are talking about these things is because sometimes it doesn't feel very safe to talk about them out in public. Because we do understand that there is a narrative out there, especially when it comes into talks of theology and church and there is a specific narrative that has been going on for a long time, which is very fundamentalist and very evangelical. And when we talk about deconstructing, that's a lot of what we're talking about that we deconstructed through the years is, where we came from, our background, evangelicalism, fundamentalism. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, I grew up, I wasn't raised in the church. My mom is Jewish and her whole family is Jewish. My father is Roman Catholic, but neither of them were churchgoers. They weren't religious. And so I didn't really discover the church until I was about 16 years old. And I went to a church. I didn't really know that much about the church, to be honest with you. Now I kind of know what that church was at that time. It was a very evangelical and very fundamentalist church in our area, very successful, quite large, as churches, were, a few churches were back then. And I just kind of started in. I enjoyed the people, but after a few years, I began to have some issues and some problems with not feeling like I fit in. And it was the kind of place where you weren't really encouraged to ask questions.
You could not challenge the leadership.
No, you did not. You did not ask questions. You just, in fact, it would be viewed as a little bit rebellious. You were supposed to just accept what the Bible said, and at that time
what they said the Bible said.
Correct.
Right?
I didn't really realize that there were some differences about what people said the Bible said. But back then, when I was 16,
was only their
it was
interpretation.
just that.
Yeah.
And so I felt like alone. I felt like I was sort of isolated. And then the hardest part probably were things like, heaven and hell, for example. So according to the church, most of my family were going to hell. Most of the members of my family, and so I felt
because they weren't evangelical.
They weren't evangelical. Yeah. They hadn't prayed the prayer. They haven't entered the church the way our church said you had to enter the church, and so they were not the children of God. They were not God's beloved. They were
because they just had to say one magical prayer.
They had to say the prayer. They had to say the prayer. They had to join the church. Well, they would have said you didn't have to join the church, but that kind of followed. And so I actually did a lot to try to what we would call evangelize my family, and made a lot of people confused by my efforts to try to convert Catholics to a belief in Jesus that they said they already believed in.
Because according to them, according to evangelicals, they don't believe in Jesus.
They don't really believe in Jesus. No. They're not really saved. They're not really converted. They're only converted if they have a particular kind of conversion experience. And I sure hope we can talk about that in one of these podcasts.
Almost definitely.
Because that was very, very confusing. So when I was about, I stuck with it for quite a number of years. I became a pastor in that tradition. At about 28 years old, I think I had my first breakdown where I realized I could no longer continue in the disparity and the disharmony between what I was experiencing and living and what I was taught was true.
Before we go further, it's interesting because you jumped from 16 to when you went into ministry. So just to let people understand, there's a lot of indoctrination that went on through those years.
Tons.
And some of the stuff we're going to be talking about in this podcast.
And there was a lot of reasons to abide by it because your friends were a part of it. Your community was a part of it. So there's a lot of pressure.
Right, to belong.
To belong. Mm-hmm. And, of course, at 16, you want to belong.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I would say that questions started coming quite quickly. And I couldn't quite make it work. So nobody said what it felt like to be saved. They just said if you did these things, you would be saved. And sometimes I'd feel sort of warm and inspired, by a service where there was a moving song. And I thought that, well, maybe that was the feeling. And so I probably went forward in meetings. Going forward, by the way, is another phrase that means certain things to evangelicals and to fundamentalists. Going forward to accept Jesus, I probably asked Jesus into my heart
like 100 million
times. At least 10 times.
Oh, you beat me.
And so
I beat you probably.
So 10 times to try to make it work, and I didn't know what that meant, and so for a long time there was just sort of this low grade kind of confusion, but I didn't really feel like I was a part of what was going on. There was something that was amiss, I thought. But I wasn't able to talk about it to anyone. They would have just considered me to be a doubter or somebody that wasn't willing to follow, the truth, the scriptures, to abide by the Bible. They would have all of these kinds of phrases. And I saw a lot of people kicked out of our church, by the way, if they didn't live correctly or didn't do quite the right things. They often
it's very cultish, right?
Very cult-like. And I wouldn't want to say that out loud because I still know a lot of the people that are a part of that group, but I feel like it had the smacked of a little bit of a cult-like feel. And there was sort of a devotion that needed to be. And the other part about this particular church is nobody else did it correctly.
Yeah, that's
we were the only ones.
Another evidence.
And I
of a
can
cult
remember,
type. Yeah.
and I can remember being a teenager, maybe 17, 18 years old, sitting in a service. Again, the pastor talking about how they had the truth, and the charismatics were wrong, and the Catholics were wrong, and the mainliners were wrong, and those seminaries were wrong, and everybody else was wrong.
Everybody
but we
was wrong
had
except
it.
them.
We had it right because we followed the scriptures. We followed the Bible, and I can remember sitting there thinking, man, I'm so lucky to have lived close to this one church in the whole
That has it
world
all right.
that had the truth. And even as I thought that thought, I was like, that's kind of, that doesn't sound right. There's something about that just doesn't seem right. But that's the way it was presented. Everybody was very dedicated to the church because the leadership presented, probably I participated in thinking that way.
Well, definitely.
That we were.
You defend it. That's why it's so hard to talk to people that are in that type of
any place else
context.
Was to give up on the truth. Staying there at this particular church, this was the way to make sure you were in God's good graces.
We used to have a saying in the denomination I come from, and I'll get into detail on that later on of where I come from, but we used to have a saying that when we go to heaven, like other people that are not from the denomination, they have to be quiet when they pass by the folks from our denomination, because they have to say, shh, be quiet, because why? They think they're the only ones that are up here. Right. They think they're the only ones that are saved. So
Right. Well, the hardest part about it for me was that I was told it was my responsibility. I mean, everyone else was told at the same time. Nobody came up to me and told me it was just my responsibility. But it was a member's responsibility to make sure that other people got to heaven. It was my job. I had to make sure that every single person I met, I was told that it was my job to, what we called, witness to them.
And the guilt trip that they would give you if you're not evangelizing people and you're not bringing your friends to church and they're not converting and they're going to hell and it's going to be blood on your head.
The psychological trauma in my head as a 16, 17-year-old was intense. I couldn't go anywhere, to the point that in our grad night at our high school, my wife and I laugh about this. Grad night in high school, we were all allowed to go to Disneyland for grad night. It was a big night. All the high schools did it. Well, when I had to pass out tracts. Now you laugh because there might be some of our listeners who don't know what tracts are and what this means. Pass out tracts.
Yeah.
It was my job not to go and enjoy Disneyland.
By the way, what kind of tracks were they? Were they chick tracks or which
they were Four Spiritual Laws tracks.
Okay.
You remember the Four Spiritual Laws?
Yeah, I
chick
remember
tracks.
those.
All
the
these
chick
other
tracks were
but
like the most horrifying.
But I did something else, Alex. I got to tell you about this. Is true confessions. I also wrote out my testimony.
Oh goodness! On the track?
On a sheet of paper.
Oh, okay.
It took like 2 sides, sheet of paper, and gave out my number, my phone number.
Wow.
And told them how I became a Christian, and it was really sincere. I mean, I can tell you that I really heartfelt meant what I was doing. And yet it was so misguided.
Yeah.
And here I was, a graduating senior, and I did it because my church told me it was my main job as a human, as a Christian.
Yeah.
I had to get other people saved. It was my job to do it.
Because on Judgment Day, you're going to be held accountable.
Absolutely.
If not, you know what?
The blood, I was told, their blood was on my hands.
In your hands. Yep. That's it.
Now we connected because we were told we were very different communities. You
Right.
grew up in this community.
Okay.
I grew up in this other community. Very different communities, but
The theology is
we both
so
experienced
alike.
the kind of psychological pressure.
Yep.
And then the verse that was probably spoken more often than any, you would think, for God so loved the world, the misinterpretation of that,
Right.
that was the verse most often, but it wasn't. The most often quote was, "They went out from us because they were never of us.
Oh my goodness.
Had they been of us, they would have remained with us, but they went out from us to let it be known that they were not really of us." First John.
That is such a gaslighting verse
my word.
that is used for people that like have left the church because of any type of
Anything.
spiritual abuse or
Or-
deconstructing
Or go, yeah.
and so the moment they leave and they deconstruct that faith or that theology, they're like, okay, but they never really were with us.
True Christians stay,
Right.
false Christians leave.
Right.
That's just the way it was. Anybody in any other, especially anybody in the mainline church, anybody in charismatic churches, anybody in the Catholic Church, they were not real Christians. They were not really saved.
Right. That's just
And
Wow.
so as a result of that, now it's possible that there were people that were there at that time that didn't pick up that message. And I'm willing to say that maybe I misunderstood some things, maybe, but I'd stayed there a long time. And I think that, unfortunately, I think that a lot of the things that I experienced, I find are fairly common among those who grew up in the evangelical circles.
Mhm.
Because people in evangelical circles think the issue is beliefs about certain doctrines.
Mhm.
That is not the issue.
Mhm.
The issue is related to the interpretation of
Right.
how we understand that how they fit in with biblical and with an understanding of what it
Well-
means to be the family of God.
Well, when you're taking the Bible so literal, you're
Exactly.
talking about something that was written 2,000 years ago, something that was written to a culture completely foreign to what we know of and understand. Even the type of Christianity that we have nowadays compared to what it was back then. All of the different contextual, exegetical, you name it, hermeneutical stuff that just the divide that's there to understand that. For people to just look at the Bible and say, it's black and white, this is what it is. You're definitely bringing your own interpretation, your modern contemporary interpretation into something that's ancient.
Right. And in our context, it wasn't. Nobody accepted the fact that they interpreted the Bible. They claimed they believed in the literal
Yep.
Bible.
Yeah, the way it says right there. Forget
Right.
the fact that there's like a translation of a translation.
and yet it was interpreted all the time.
And yep.
And so what you said earlier, it's what you say the Bible says.
Mhm.
I mean, we were afraid in those days to assume that there were other ways of viewing the Bible and what the Bible said. It's almost as if it was our job to protect God,
Right.
to
Right.
guard the kingdom
Right.
from abuse. It was our job that God had given it to us,
Right.
to our group, to make sure people didn't get it wrong.
And whatever opposing view was gaslit completely into they're being deceived, they're heretics, and so forth and so on, so that you would dehumanize, disqualify all of the other stuff because it's only one interpretation, it's yours.
Yeah. So I pretty much left the community. But I still worked for the church at that time. It was my livelihood.
Well, that's what you knew how to do.
What I knew how to do. And so, but a period of, there's more to this, which we'll get into in future episodes.
Most definitely.
But there was an undoing of, a letting go of, what we would call deconstruction of the things I was given. And I didn't have anything to replace it, because it has to begin with, I can't think that any longer.
Mm-hmm. That's the hardest part.
It's the hardest part because it comes before you know there's anything else to replace it.
And it's scary. I know that I've talked to many deconstructing people that are deconstructing, and the hard part for them is that, like, if I do that, I'm afraid, am I really going to go to hell because of it? Because it's still lingering there for them. It's trauma. These doctrines, these dogmas, they keep you so traumatized that it's fear-based. It's not love-based, it's fear-based. And so people carry this trauma. They're afraid of deconstructing, maybe not anymore from that pastor that's going to kick them out of the church or make them look bad or however, but actually from the dogma itself. Am I going to go to hell or not? If I leave, and it's interesting because I've met people that are afraid, and then I've met people that are already on the other side where they're like, oh my God, leaving that belief system has liberated me to live a life of peace and a life of healing and so forth, right? They're thriving. But it's just, how do you get to that part? It's just so interesting.
Yeah, I think
because it's tough. You've been through it.
Yeah, a lot of my friends, a lot of people who went through similar things just left, and I think to this day they're not.
And they didn't hold on to any kind of.
No,
faith.
They just went on with their lives.
Understandably.
By the way, there was a lot of pressure from all of those who left that church and became pastors. And most of them became pastors in very similar environments. And there was a lot of tragedy in some of the lives of those folks as well. And I'm not saying that there was a correlation to or a causation for that. I'm just saying that for me, it was a very hard environment and community to feel comfortable in. And I think partly because I was an outsider. I didn't grow up in the church. My parents weren't churchgoers. My grandparents weren't churchgoers. But I think if you did grow up with your parents and grandparents, you might have felt more comfortable in that, which is why when you told me your story, I was so interested in it, because you had just the opposite. You came to the same place, but you had just the opposite sort of upbringing where your parents and grandparents,
third generation pastor,
were in it. So how did that deconstruction happen for you? I'm just wondering. For me, I just felt like, well, I'm not from a church background, but the same deconstruction process began for you.
It's interesting because when we talk about being indoctrinated, accepting that indoctrination, and then being convinced that it's the truth, for me, that's all I knew. I was born and raised in it. My dad was a pastor. My grandfather was a pastor. Now, I'm Hispanic, so there are some things that happened in the past and in their past, and well, my dad's past and my grandfather's, that they went through racism, which even within, of course, the church context, especially within the church context, sadly, that, they were part of a denomination coming from Pentecostal charismatic denominations. So for us, it was very legalistic, very evangelical, but at the same time, very experiential. So that's what would keep a lot of people in it, because it was the experience of God, the emotional aspects of it. And that experience is how people would just return and return and return, even though they were still questioning the belief system, the doctrines, but at the same time, you can't help it. God is here because you're being manipulated emotionally in many ways, So, and I knew that up front, even though I didn't understand what manipulation was, but you kind of would look at it and think, is this real or not real? What's going on here? But they went through issues in their denomination where they did a split. And then their denomination that they started was mostly Hispanic, Spanish speaking. So there was, in a sense, a bubble of protection from, interacting with more of the institutional discriminations and so forth, so on. But within my context, they still had a colonized theology, a colonized way of believing. In other words, they were discipled first and foremost into the evangelical, mainly white theology. Most of the people that we read, the books that we were reading, were from white theologians. This is, the whole accepting a colonized way of believing. So growing up in this context, we were taught all of these evangelical, beliefs. As I grew up, I rebelled against it because specifically was a pastor's kid. Usually, mostly every pastor kid rebels. And I just didn't want anything to do with the church, anything to do with God. Came around, was converted. And then I really felt a call to do the same things that, my dad did and my grandfather did, which is go into ministry. Went to Bible school, was fully indoctrinated in that. And it was interesting because even in the indoctrination of it, it wasn't like I was learning a lot of new things. The thing about evangelicalism and fundamentalism is that there's no room for newness. You're just repackaged the same. Even in contemporary churches, I come into a contemporary church, I want to learn a new thing. It doesn't mean that I'm not learning some aspects of new things, but it's the repackaged, same old evangelical belief system. And so when I was taught this, I went into ministry with my wife. When we went into ministry in Bible schools, when I married my wife, we go into our first congregation. And when we go into our first congregation, one of the things that we encountered, we had never fully encountered, was the immigrant population. And both my wife and I started pastoring this population, or this church, in this city where mostly immigrants lived in, and immigrants from Latin America. We thought we were going to go in there and teach them, discipleship, truly disciple them. Instead, they ended up discipling us. And what I mean by that is that they brought to our attention injustices that did not coincide with the belief system that we had. So, like you started saying, I started questioning. I started questioning these things as a pastor. And I started feeling really weird about things. And I would tell my wife during the time that we were there, several years that we were there, I was like, do I even belong here? Am I supposed? And my wife's looking at me like, what is wrong with you? Yeah. You came in here with passionate, you really wanted to do this, and then all of a sudden you feel like this isn't for you? What are you? And I thought, first of all, am I questioning the ministry, or am I questioning my belief system? Something's very faulty here. And I'm not really, I'm not with it. There's just something wrong. And then when that denomination, we took up another pastorate up in Northern California, and it's during that time that everything started to fall apart, which was a good thing for us. Well, it wasn't a good thing when you were going through it. No. But, and I'm sure you can relate to that. It got to a situation where
I feel so lonely and lost.
My marriage started falling apart. When I'd go up to preach, I didn't want to preach anymore. I felt no passion for ministry. I felt no passion for anything. And basically, my wife left me for a moment. And it was a thing that really jarred me because it made me evaluate what's more important, my family or this ministry or even this whole belief system that I'm in. And for me, that was like the first step of moving away from it. I had resigned from that ministry. Now, that wasn't an easy step for us at all. Because like with you, that's the only thing I knew how to do. So when we left that, during that time is when I thought contemporary churches, because ours was a bit more traditional, I guess that is a deconstruction for me, so I thought. So I go into these contemporary types of churches. I even come on staff at a mega church and learn all about mega churches. I mean, it wasn't that it wasn't fun. There was a lot of fun aspects to it. But I noticed something that was really wrong is the fact that we're still dealing with the same type of fundamentalism. But then you begin to think, is this the only way? Is this what I'm stuck with? But there was always these questions. There's something more to this because I saw so much injustice with this doctrine, with this belief system. With this belief system is always excluding people. It's always excluding. It's always judging. It doesn't matter how repackaged it looked and how modern it looked and how nice it looked, the lights, the show. It just was not built for compassion and love, truly. So even though it was more seeker, sensitive, meaning, we're not gonna be so Christianese like and condemning like. We're gonna invite people in, like we were talking about bait and switch. You do all these events, all these people come in. Yeah. This is beautiful, and then you do the switch. Right. But here's the fundamentalist teaching. Right. So all of that started really shifting me and Liz too, into a whole different way of thinking and challenging our belief system. And it started, for us, it started like about maybe 10 years, no, even a little bit more than that, that we started this journey of just saying, you know what, this isn't right. And it wasn't like for us overnight, For some people, it kind of is, and that's great, For us, it had to take some time because we still had to establish what does faith really look like. And it's not like we're at a point where now we know. We're like, okay, we're still redefining and reconstructing a faith in God and in Christ that does not reflect or look like what we used to have. And again, that's more topics that we can talk about. But it was difficult to just do all of those all the shifting, all the adjustments, all the changes, how that impacted us, how that impacted our children after that, how that, just the whole thing. And I want to talk about that in another time, in another episode, that we can talk about how the institution of the church can be harmful. And what are ways that it can be reformed, because another topic is the reformation of the church and what we're looking at now. And we do believe that there is shifting and changing happening in the church in general. So the narrative, what is it that we need to be hearing right now? What are the things that we need to be talking about? And why are so many people leaving the institution of the church, but yet there's still so many that want to hold on to faith? What is left for them? What was left for us? Even what is left for us? Because I know we're still in this work. We're still in the ministry. We're still in, but yet we're unpacking something.
Yeah. Did you have a problem when you started finding new things that you learned about them and thought about them differently than those original evangelical fundamentalist truths, how they were presented and how you were asked to think about them? What I'm getting at is one of the securities in the fundamentalism or evangelical world was the claim of certainty, the claim of reality, the claim of knowing without question. This kind of way of saying, and then when you learn things later in a more balanced, open exploration kind of way, certainty isn't really what you're after. And so that's hard at first. It's hard to say, well, I had this certainty. Why do I feel so ambiguous about what I'm learning?
It's scary, isn't
it's
it?
scary. So
scary.
all of a sudden you have to have a different appreciation for what you learn or what you can know. I think of all those verses that talk about the unknowable God, the God that is beyond our, and how absurd, to be honest, that I thought as a 16-year-old that I had God understood, figured out how the system worked.
You were certain.
And I was so happy.
At 16, you made it.
I was like, when I first heard it, I thought, I've been looking for this my whole life, that I know God is this way. God will do this. This will happen. If you don't do this, you get this. And, I kind of had it all figured out. And I had little proof texts that would prove all these different things. And I think to myself, now looking back, how absurd that I would think in this grand universe that we live in a God that is infinite, beyond all knowledge, all the things that we said about God back then, that somehow I would have a certainty. And so one of the hardest parts to get used to as you move out of that and move into something new is that it doesn't come packaged in the same way. It doesn't come packaged in that superiority or that arrogance of thinking that I know all there is to know. It comes more in curiosity, in progress, in discovery.
And that's humility.
And everything I learned,
you don't know.
You have more questions. Everything you learn, you get another question. And that question leads you to other discoveries, which bring other questions. It's another way of, and you're okay with that because that's the way it was made. That's the way we're made. And all of a sudden, you're not going to hell because of that.
Right.
You're actually discovering the joys of becoming and the joys of development and of exploration. Anyway,
I think one of the things for me that was so key was understanding that the Bible is not inerrant and infallible. That the Bible was never meant to be at the level of God, and that the Bible actually isn't God's word. That's a big one right there. Right now, I can imagine
you're making people going to turn this off. Like they're like, "Ooh, that's."
It doesn't mean that it wouldn't have people speaking God's word, but it's never. I know people will pull out their clobber verses saying, especially the one in what is it, First Timothy, right, chapter 3. Oh, there's my alarm. First Timothy, chapter 3. 16 or 2 Timothy, isn't it?
All scriptures given.
Yeah, inspired by God. When understanding those, what that means in and of itself, we're not talking about, and I don't want to go into too much detail. We got to do a whole episode on that one.
Oh yeah.
So stay tuned for that. But
several.
But once, and I won't go into detail, but once I understood that the scripture isn't infallible, the scripture isn't inerrant. First it's scary. It's like, well, what the heck have I been believing in? But we have to understand that Christ definitely was historic. Jesus was historic. There's a lot of evidence for that. But my point is, what's written there is written as a way of an example, as a way of lessons for us to learn, as a way of something that's pointing in the direction of what humanity looks like, what humanity can do when it does good and when it does bad, what humanity, all of that, and what the claim of the revelation of God being in the person of Jesus Christ. And we can go into all those details. But my point here is, I was taught never to challenge the scripture, really challenge the interpretation that I was given. When we begin to challenge interpretations, specifically when you're looking at it in an academic way too, and more specifically in that direction, you begin to understand, what? People never really, really looked at how things were and how things, how the Bible was written and how things, were back in the day and how people believed back in the day and how we believe now. And for me, it was a way of saying, it actually liberated my mind and liberated me. Not to doubt, but like how you just said, to bring not the uncertainty of it, helped me to begin to explore once again what faith really is. And that for me was powerful, because then I couldn't just say, okay, it always has to be this because this is what I was taught. And it's like, no, there is so much more to explore. I mean, and why would God want us to be just caught up in interpretation of a book?
Yeah. Well, my security back then, I was taught, was based on my understanding, my comprehension, and my dedication to the truth as it was presented. Whereas now, security is rooted in a sense that God cares about me, that God loves me,
Right.
and that I will never fully grasp all there is to know about truth, reality, theology. That I will continue to be able to explore, what things mean and how they relate to healthy living and wholesome living. But that I can relax in that process, not because I know certain things,
Right.
but because God knows me. There's a friend of mine wrote a book, God. We talk so much about certain beliefs about God or believing in God, and the book was called God Believes in You. And that's the security, is that God, however I conceive God to be, believes in me, loves me, cares about me. And it's a relationship that can allow me to relax in my pursuits, in my curiosities. So I don't have to be worried that if I get it wrong, that I'm going to have a lightning bolt from heaven striking me dead, or I may spend a whole eternity burning in a hot fire, right?
And that's the whole point of unconditional love.
Yeah.
That's something that for me, if you're talking about a certainty, for me, it's the certainty of the unconditional love of God. When you talk about the unconditional love of God, that to me is what we strive for, what we're trying to conform our lives to. It's how much are we loving? And it's so funny because growing up in an evangelical background, it's always how much are you how much are you believing in? How much are your beliefs? It's like you're guided by your belief system. You're not guided by love. Because if you were guided by love, then you'd have to deconstruct your belief system, because it's your belief system that excludes people.
Yeah.
See, and as in my deconstruction, as I went on, I began to ask those questions. For instance, why are LGBTQ people being excluded? What are the reasons why? Because of faulty interpretations. But those interpretations are creating a dogma system that excludes. Then how can you call this unconditional love if you're putting a condition on it? So those are a lot of the things that are going on. But you know what? We have a lot to talk about. And we definitely are going to hone in on several of these subjects, because both Bob and I are in ministry. And we kind of want to talk about that too, because what's the reasons why we're even here in doing ministry? What do we actually believe we want to achieve by being in ministry? And I like what you said, and I want to close with this. And we can go and talk about other subjects as we go with our other episodes. But you talked about a community. And I think that a lot of us that believe the way we believe, it is scary. Not a lot of people are boldly talking about it. Well, more and more people are starting to talk about it. You see a lot of TikToks and stuff out there. But there's still a lot of people that are kind of afraid of coming out and questioning things, and questioning the church institution, questioning the Bible, questioning a lot of stuff. And I think that people need community for that. People need to feel there's a safe space for that, where they can say, I can talk about these things. I can question the Bible without being judged or condemned. I can question God without being judged or condemned. And I think this podcast in some ways creates a community like that. And we'd love some feedback. I hope so too. We'd love some feedback to see if anybody out there is, really.
I can remember how alone I felt for years when I first started questioning and first started wondering. And it felt bad. It felt terrible. I can give you some stories, but it just felt terrible.
You couldn't even connect with your old friends.
No.
Because you're in a totally different space now.
No, and it wasn't allowed. It wasn't acceptable. So it took a long time for me to find people that I could talk to. And now it's great, because I think there's people who've written about it now and who are speaking about it, churches that are acknowledging some of these changes, some of this deconstruction. So that's a big part of what we wanted. We wanted to be there for people who maybe have gone through this experience, but haven't really found any connections with any group or people that were like-minded who went through similar things. And so I'm hoping that people will find us and want to engage with our conversation and interact. Podcasts are great because we can hear from listeners and respond to their questions, and just sort of be on a journey together, discovering how do you recover after
and where you're at on this journey. And that you really aren't alone. We're still on this journey. There's still a lot that we're unpacking, deconstructing, and even reconstructing. So it is scary. There's a lot of unknowns.
Can be. But some people have been comfortable just letting it go, not taking religion and just pushing it off, and maybe they might even be interested in finding how others maybe found some things that were worth recovering.
And now that you're saying that, I have in the future a guest that was a good friend of mine. He also was a pastor within the evangelical circles. He right now says he's an atheist, and I want us to talk to him about his deconstruction of his faith. And what led him to where he's at now. And he's still a really good friend of mine. That's the whole point. It's just right away, we evangelicals and how we were taught was demonize the person that doesn't believe in God. And well, there are reasons why they're where they're at. And that doesn't mean they're bad people. There are things that, and we can talk about that too, the whole universalist theology that we can talk about in one of our episodes too. I like that we're throwing all this out there so everyone could understand that we're going to be talking about a lot of stuff.
Absolutely.
Not all over the place like right now, but this is our first episode. We're introducing a lot of stuff that we want to talk about, and we're going to be talking about that in the next episode. Please stay tuned. This is going to be really good.
Absolutely.
So We'll close up. Any final words that you have?
I just I hope this can be a conversation, and that's why the two of us are doing it together, because this is a conversation. But I don't want it to be just between the two of us. I would love to see it to be a conversation among listeners who are equally as interested and concerned and curious
even
about these areas.
Questions that, I want to leave it open. Like we're going to be, posting these podcasts. There's video to it also. So like on Instagram, even TikTok and other places that we want to just, be uploading them to. And if there are questions that we see in the comments that we could even talk about, I think that would be a great thing, even if it's just introductory or a whole episode on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I look forward to it. I think it's interesting. It's I love theology. I do love the Bible, and I had to let it all go at a certain point in order to figure out a way to find it again.
I love it even more in the sense of its literature and its ancient writings and ways. Looking at it in a different way, I would say academically, for me has liberated even the Bible itself from the trappings of all the interpretations that we were giving it, that a lot of them wouldn't make sense. Yeah. And I know we're going to talk about a lot of those things too. But absolutely. Bob, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
This is amazing. Our first episode.
Here we go.
It's we're gonna be launching it out. It's gonna be pretty amazing. Just stay tuned. We'll give you all the information. Our intros and outros, we'll do that too. Like where to go. And if you want to contact us, how to do that too. So, Bob, thank you.
Yep.
All right. Well, till next time. We'll see you then.
Thanks for tuning in today. If you have questions, a comment, or just need more information, make sure to follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. Just search for Deconstructors Club Podcast. Also, you can watch these episodes on YouTube by subscribing to our Deconstructors Club Podcast page. Remember, you're not alone in this journey.